Welcome. My name is William Swinton. I am the director of the International Business Studies program at Temple University. For you who are new to this program, we started the Sustainability Roundtable about this time last year, September of last year, physically at Temple University. Temple University is headquartered in Philadelphia in the United States, and our Japan campus has been here since 1982. And last year, we reached out to Trista Bridges and Donald Eubank of Read the Air to help us look at ways that businesses are addressing issues of sustainability. And over the last couple of months, last year, and particularly the last couple of months, we've been doing this online. And among the things that we've looked at is impact investing. And this is actually kind of the second in a series. We have some great guests lined up for this evening to give you their perspectives, both from a global standpoint as well as a Japan and Asia standpoint. So we think that that's going to be quite interesting and helpful. We'll have a discussion from about 7 o'clock to 8 o'clock this evening, and then we'll open up. We can all turn on our cameras and turn on our mics and have an open discussion after that. In the meantime, if you have any questions, feel free to put the questions into the chat. As I mentioned, we have been doing a number of sessions on impact vesting. We did one, I think, 2 months ago. And then next month, if Trevor will go to the next slide, we'll kind of have a third in the series, if you will, but we won't be the lead on that. GRIPS, which is a think tank here in Japan, will be having a session on impact investing, and we'll be supporting that. And we hope that all of you will tune into that session as well. We'll be sending out this information to everyone who's joining this meeting, so you don't have to jot it down quickly. We'll also come back to this slide later. I'd now like to turn it over to Donald and Trista, particularly Donald, to introduce our speakers for this evening.
Thank you, Swint. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for everyone who's joined us tonight. I'm really excited about this session. We're going to dive into what's a fairly new and a fairly difficult subject of impact measurement and impact management with two experts in the field. Karl Richter, who is the director of EngagedX, which is a social impact consultant, and Katsuji Imata-san, who is the president of the Social Impact Management Institute in Japan. He's also the head of CSO Network Japan and the co-CEO of Blue Marble. So we'll have a presentation from Trista and myself first to introduce the field of impact measurement and management briefly, and then we'll hand it over to the experts. We'll hand it over to Karl, who will speak about his impact management for everyone rubric and the developments that he's seen in this space recently. We'll have a quick question with him, and then we'll go to Imata-san to speak more about impact investing as impact management in Japan. So with that, I will let Trista start our introduction.
Next slide, please. Okay, so our views on impact, sustainable investing and impact investing. So we've spoken at our previous sessions about our book, Leading Sustainably, which came out this summer. We actually, we did quite a bit of analysis on this topic in our book, and we kind of tackled it from two levels. So the first one being sustainable investing, all that you basically do in the public markets. So some of the things that we were seeing, for example, around ESG, we've seen a lot of momentum there, and also impact investing in the private equity and private space. And this was a really interesting topic for us because we felt that, in order to advance the SDGs, we absolutely need more mechanisms for investing in social and environmental type businesses or organizations or projects or ideas. But the challenge that we have obviously is measurement. And one of the things that we explored in the book was several frameworks in terms of how we could do that. And we'll actually speak with Karl tonight, Karl Richter, and he'll kind of give us a bit of a background on one of those methodologies that we really liked and we explore in more detail in the book. So we'll talk about that when Karl comes on, but just to kind of say that the book does shed some additional light around this topic, and there's some helpful information there. Next slide, please. Great. So what is impact? So impact is just quite simply is a change in positive or negative outcome for people or the planet. And one of the frameworks that has come out in the last few years is the Impact Management Projects Framework. And this is an interesting one, and it's one that actually was developed through a lot of consensus, more than 2,000 practitioners from around the world coming from with different perspectives and experiences. There were people who were actually within businesses and elsewhere. It's a very interesting and very helpful framework to use. And so what this does is just quite simply is it says that organizations, they basically have to understand their positive impacts, and they also have to understand their negative impacts, right? So we like to often think about what are the good things that these initiatives can do, but we have to also think about, are there any negative impacts of what these projects and businesses do as well? Okay, next slide, please. If we look at this slide, basically the landscape in terms of impact measurement is pretty vast now. There's lots of different organizations that are working around this topic. It's a very difficult one and a tricky one, as Donald said, and we're kind of in a period of innovation, really, if you think about this particular topic. Lots of very interesting ideas out there, but at the moment, there's lots going on. So tonight we would really love our speakers to kind of shed some light around some of the things that are going on, some of the frameworks that we're seeing, and how organizations are managing and tackling, thinking about measuring their impact. Donald?
Apology for the lag there. My computer's a little bit slow on the share. But I just wanted to review a couple of sort of the easier things to think about in these frameworks when you're looking at impact. So this is from the Impact Management Project that Trista just mentioned, also known as IMP. And it's looking at investors' intentions as they relate to three types of impact. A, act to avoid harm, B, benefit stakeholders, or C, contribute to solutions. And what you see on the left side here, does or may cause harm, I believe that's more of the realm of ESG, which investors are more familiar with now. ESG also goes a little bit into act to avoid harm, where you're looking at risk management and you're doing negative screenings. But when we're talking about impact investing, we're talking about something with intention, with intention to have a positive impact, and something that's measurable. So we're looking to benefit the stakeholders that are going to receive an outcome from the projects that are, in this case, being invested in, or to go even further than that and to contribute to solutions, the kinds of solutions that we see targeted within the SDGs. So within the Impact Management Project, they've pulled out 5 dimensions of impact. And the reason why they've done this is because they see that most of the time when people are measuring the outcomes of a project, they're just looking at the first 2. They're looking at what is being done and looking at who is it being done to. But they believe to actually understand whether you're having a positive or negative impact, you have to look at 3 more dimensions. You have to look at how much of the outcome occurs, what is the contribution that the investor and the project owner are making that is additional, that goes beyond what would have happened anyways, or what someone else is already doing. And the 5th one is risk. And here it says the risk to people and planet, that the impact does not occur as expected, but it also includes the risk to you to be able to measure and quantify that impact actually happening. So it could be that you can't get proper reporting or you don't get the outcome that you expect as well. Now, what does this look like in practice? I'm not going to get too deep into this, but this is essentially the GSG logic model for trying to determine whether or not you're achieving impact. And we've applied it in a project that we're working on called Minka Life, which is Japan-based, and it's looking at taking abandoned houses, also known as akiya, and turning them into community centers that can be used to help revitalize the community by creating a business center and attracting in foreign tourists. So when you try to determine whether or not what the impact would be of this project, you look at the stakeholders who are affected, the inputs that the project would have on that community, the activities that the project would do, the output as a result of those activities, and then what's the outcome that comes out of that output. And I'll let Karl and Imata-san talk more about this difference, but output is simply what the activities result in. Outcome is the positive impact we're looking at. And then a long-term outcome, which is similar to the kinds of goals we see in the SDGs. And here for this one, after this full process, which is just, it's time consuming, it takes work, we determined that there were two outputs that we should be looking at to measure the impact. The number of permanent residents in the area that increased over time, and the number of jobs that increased because of the project. So despite all the things that go in, you may come out with very simple outputs on the other side. One other thing worth mentioning is that we talk about measurement, but we also need to talk about management, because with impact, it's an ongoing process. It's not a set once and forget. It's that you need to continually return and make sure that the project is doing as you intended it to. So you need to have a strategy at the start, strategic intent. And this is from the IFC, which is under the World Bank. And they've created this, this well-known framework for managing output over time. You'll see this many times if you've looked at impact investing. Origination and structuring is the manager actually committed to what he's doing and what's his contribution. Portfolio management over time, monitoring the progress of the event of the projects and how they're working towards an impact one way or the other. And then at the end, that when they make an exit, you know, if they sell the project on to a new owner, are they actually selling it on looking to have that new owner commit to continuing the impact, or are they just looking to make a financial profit? So for an impact investment to be considered an impact investment, it has to have impact across the life cycle of the project and beyond. I just want to give a scale of what we're talking about here. So in the past year, we saw sustainable investment rising to 30.7 trillion assets under management, and that's just in developed countries. Within that, impact investing is just $715 billion as of December 2019, only 2.3%. It's a significant amount of money under management, but compared to the total of sustainable investment, it's small. Yet we anticipate that that percentage will grow rapidly. Well, I shouldn't say rapidly, but will grow in the next year, over the next couple of years, as people start to think more about impact investing and see it as a way to start to achieve the SDGs. So I'll stop there, and with no further ado, I'll hand it over to Karl, and he can introduce impact for everyone and speak more about the field of impact investing today, the impact measurement and management today.
That's great. Thank you, Donald. And good evening to everybody in Japan, and good local time to people beyond that. I think that's how it's customary to say hello these days when we're speaking on Zoom. So I can see, Donald, I can see you. Can you just confirm that you can see the screen share?
I can see your screen now.
That's great. So I'd like to start talking about maybe giving a little bit more context behind the rubric that I developed. And there were a few conversations going on at the time. The time I'm thinking of was between 2015 and 2017. 2017, I was consulting for the UN, and specifically within the development program. They were looking to promote impact investing and a new partnership between the private sector and the UN, or public sector generally. And there were also a lot of conversations that the OECD had been coordinating around presenting the evidence base for impact investing. And within those various conversations, the idea was starting to sharpen that, you know, and you touched on it in the introduction, that people are interested in trying to understand, how do we manage impact? In other words, how do we actually go beyond just measuring and counting the non-financial things that happen from a business activity or from an investment, but how do we actually go a little bit deeper and manage towards those outcomes so that we can set those as goals and we can set our agenda towards that. And that's where the language came from, and trying to then somehow pull together all of those conversations across public sector, private sector, charities were doing and have been doing impact measurement and management, development finance agencies as well, private sector organizations, private equity, investors, and how do we bring all of that language together? And the landscape, because it's not really all that regulated, ends up with an incredible amount of terminology, and a lot of it is overlapping. A lot of it over time stretches and expands, and therefore different people use the terminology in a different way, and it becomes quite overloaded, and people often end up then trying to introduce different specific terms, and we saw some of them in the logic model that Donald, you described there, the progression from inputs here in the middle of the slide, inputs through to outputs, outcomes, and impact, and it becomes quite overwhelming to try and understand what people are talking about. And I was wondering, in terms of just trying to organize this for myself and in my own mind, in terms of trying to understand what is similar, where are things actually the same, and how do we communicate this to people? I found that it was quite helpful trying to organize what was going on in terms of the different methodologies that people were advocating for or expecting to see or promoting. And so extracting that as one dimension to assess and organize all of these different things, from less intensive methodologies on the one hand to more intensive on the other hand, and wondering whether we can structure that and come up with a rubric, a model for this. And of course, by creating such a model, you create a little bit more clarity, but you also lose a lot of the nuance. And that's the trade-off that you've got to go through. And try to work out, well, how many of these different pathways could there be? And you can think of a pathway as a strategy or an approach to doing impact management. And we ended up with a group of interns at the UN looking through, basically doing desktop research, looking at how other people were defining their impact measurement and impact management activities. And we eventually categorized them into these effectively 7 categories, although there are only really 6 categories. Plus on the left, we see, acknowledging that some people are agnostic to impact and others that don't prioritize and manage impact. And it was really important to move away from the language that we were observing, such as ESG or ethical finance, because they were so loaded and carried with it an implied meaning. So we used very simple language to define those different pathways. And they're very similar to the ABC that Donald mentioned early on. And in fact, there's an overlay here, and it might be more convenient to use fewer categories like they have, only 4 categories, or it might be more useful to use more. It really doesn't matter. It's really a way to organize the information in your mind and how to then look at what's going on and observing what's going on. And we started to then use it to organize, different activities that we would observe. For example, and we're moving from left to right, if you remember, less intensive methodologies on the left, and accumulating and adding progressively to the right and becoming more intensive on the right. So the first thing we found is, as soon as people enter into the realm, the first thing, people have been doing even for decades and almost centuries is the first lens they apply is to exclude the things that do harm. And so it's negative screening. And then moving beyond that, maybe into wanting good, there's a number of different techniques that people might use, from different filters, applying principles. So you might be familiar with the principles of responsible investing, or looking at labels like fair trade and other things, or looking at ratings and indices to try and orientate and identify maybe best-in-class investments, or identify compare between 2 different products, fair trade versus not fair trade fruit, and so forth. Beyond that, in the middle, in the yellow column, we see a progression evolving. People then add on the requirement to start tracking indicators or key performance indicators, specifically against targets. Initially, those might be outputs, that people are measuring, which are very tangible. They are really the result of the activity. What happens? How do we count really what happens? For example, the number of patients a doctor might see, the number of children attending a school, the number of the tons of carbon dioxide emitted. It's a very basic level assessment. Beyond that, we see people adding on different, increasing the complexity of the methodology, starting to think about a theory of change or a logic model, but really starting to understand what are the drivers, what affects other things, and can we actually start putting this into a stronger philosophical context and trying to understand, well, if this happens and that happens and these assumptions also occur, then probably certain outcomes will happen. So if we know that, for example, children are well fed, they've had a good night's rest, and they attend a well-structured class, they'll probably tend towards getting a good learning outcome. Beyond that, we see then the assessment of those outcomes, as it were. What is actually the result of that deeper level of thinking? And this often allows people to start thinking about what happens in the context of how it affects people specifically. So we're thinking there of, stakeholder engagement, and thinking, how do these outputs affect people specifically? And I quite like the way the OECD tries to differentiate between an output and an outcome. They refer to an output as a measure of the things that happen, whereas an outcome is a measure of how effective your decisions are, or how effective your decisions have been in achieving specific goals, whether those are educational outcomes or around climate change and so forth. And we find a lot of people also then try and push a little bit farther and deeper, talking about maybe deep impact or deeper analysis, looking at things more holistically, looking at also not just the things that we expect to happen, but also maybe trying to understand the unexpected, the unintended consequences. And so we end up with a spectrum that builds up and allows to orientate people. And very importantly, I've always emphasized that it's about identifying the pathway that is appropriate for your context, for your needs, for your understanding, for your own expertise and awareness, and very importantly, the resources, because from left to right, we can imagine an increase in the amount of resources that are required. So again, you can see the progression of that logic in terms of using very simple language to describe what happens and how that progresses up from left to right and becomes progressively more intensive. And we then also looked at the different processes, and this touches on, I think, what Imata-san is going to be talking about later on in some of his slides in terms of the quality management process, and maybe linkages to the idea, or ideas of continuous improvement, and particularly in Japan, the idea of Kaizen. But if you look at the different stages that I've got on the left-hand side from top to bottom, you can roughly see the idea of initially starting out with good planning, doing and execution, acting and checking, and very importantly, this is not really a technical diagram, but hopefully carries the message that we see that complexity evolving in terms of process as well. But very importantly, it's the same process for managing impact that we see right across the spectrum. People use different words, different ways of describing, but it's the same process, just being used and applied with different levels of intensity. And the emphasis maybe in the difference between just measuring and management can also be seen in this idea of an iterative process and a feedback loop. So this idea of learning and improving, and that idea of continuous improvement, evolving the knowledge and the awareness within organizations. Another thing we identified was this idea that we can almost cluster these approaches into reactive and proactive approaches. And between the two is the idea of somebody's worldview that becomes really relevant. So if you think to the left of that little globe, so the yellow pathway, get facts to the left, they often can be applied outside of somebody's worldview and their own ethical framework. Whereas to the right of that, when we start to think about a theory of change, we have to acknowledge that people have different views, they have different ethical frameworks, they tend to then be applying that through their impact management, and sometimes that is really intentional, that is what people want to investigate, but also sometimes that introduces bias. And so often in conversations with people in organizations, I would talk to them and saying, well, we need to also think of the mindset and the reason you have for managing impact. If it's to do with compliance reasons or simply commercial risk management, then maybe the pathways on the left are more suitable, where we can see that the assessments can align and correlate. So we can all agree, if we look at the ticker on the call today, we can all agree how many people are on the call. It's very factual, it's incontrovertible data. But, if we try to ask a more deeper question, such as what is the level of value that people are getting out of the call, we'd need to speak to each person individually and assess that. So that would be on the right-hand side, that would be looking towards understanding, value judgments and more deeper, let's say, intellectual levels of engagement where the different assessments and insights can diverge. So different people who are doing the assessment will reach different conclusions. And that's sometimes okay, but we need to be mindful that when we're looking for comparable information and standardized information versus very specific information, different pathways can be applied in different ways and be different in their effectiveness. And very importantly, if we're trying to structure our business where the primary objective is to help support the Sustainable Development Goals, then certainly I would be encouraging people to think about those deeper value judgments and perhaps some of the deeper pathways to help them convert and use impact management as a deeper business strategy tool. Did somebody come in, or am I running out of time maybe?
Yes, I actually wanted to jump in with a question.
Yeah, sure.
If you don't mind. We spoke a little bit earlier about the different ways or the different scenarios in which impact can be discussed, and impact measurement specifically can be discussed. So whether that be in a private equity or private market situation, whether it be within a public company, or you talked about NGOs, et cetera, et cetera. How does impact and the impact measurement, and in the concept of impact measurement or its applicability, change in these different contexts?
Yeah, that's great, and I think it becomes a really great question because it starts to sharpen the focus around what do we mean by management. And I quite like the idea of maybe taking a step back and as a context point, thinking about the difference between management accounts and maybe other management financial accounts versus maybe financial accounts that you will send on to a tax office or other reporting. And when we're talking about management accounts, the information that is relevant there is for the executives of an organization to understand, their daily cash flow, their invoicing and so forth, and how does that affect their day-to-day decision making. And so in that context, impact management would be looking at those non-financial issues that are relevant for the organization, that are material for the organization. And then how does management actually get the right information to be able to manage effectively against these issues, particularly if the organization is a social enterprise or another larger organization, maybe a corporate that is targeting the Sustainable Development Goals. And in that context, I think we also then can imagine the difference between an organization, an enterprise, and an investor. So an investor is one step removed from the organization that is creating the impact. So then we're in a situation where an organization that was maybe invested in by an investor has to report onwards to an investor. And so that's a different kind of maybe information. Sometimes maybe that information needs to be simplified or it needs to be structured in a different way. But ultimately what we're talking about is a good impact investor will be then pulling in information for their management accounts and wanting to know how effectively are they investing their capital. And so that's a very different management challenge that they're looking to understand. And so it can be understandable also that you might have to accept that there's different types of information that are being reported. Hopefully they'd be consistent, hopefully they'd be rooted in the same reality, but they might need to be packaged in a different way.
Great, thank you so much. Donald, I think we need to discuss or talk with Imata-san now. We probably should transition, and Karl, please do hang on. We'll come back to more questions later on.
Yes, so Imata-san will speak next for the viewers, Imata-san recently had cataract surgery, so he's not going to be on camera. But Imata-san, you can start your presentation now.
Thank you, Donald. Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. Like Donald said, I won't be able to have my camera on, but I think you can see my pretty picture. So please bear with that. Donald, maybe can you show us your slide again and the one about the IMP's ABC? Because hearing what you had to say in the introduction, Trista and Donald, and hearing what Karl has to say, I kind of like to take maybe 2 steps back to kind of share with you all my understanding of why we are talking about what we are talking about today, which is about impact investing. And as Trista and Donald beautifully set it up, I think you should ask this question about why are we talking about this? Because as Donald mentioned, it's only 2.3% of the impact investing is only 2.3% of the whole sustainable investment, volume. It's just a small sibling, maybe a last, child within the realm of the sustainable investment, which has evolved a lot over the last 10, 15, 20 years. And people are so enmeshed or interested in ESG, and many in mainstream investors and institutional investors are now really focusing on different mechanisms, machineries around the ESG. And it's a minority of people like ourselves who are interested in impact investing. And if you ask me why I have that interest, my answer is that it has a transformative nature within the game of the whole capitalism. So we are not really like dreamers, but we seriously talk about next phase of our capitalism. And we call it from shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. And where, people, not just the shareholders, but the different stakeholders have a say into the decision making of the companies who needs to make money, and of the investors who needs to make sure their investees make money for their fiduciary duty. These are all the conversations that we are having right now. And then this slide that Donald is showing right now from the IMP kind of pictures that very, very vividly why we are focusing on impact investing, because we are all interested in C, contribute to solutions. Now, as Donald mentioned, ESGs tend to focus more on negative screening. So the circle on the left, or maybe up to act to avoid harm. So the thinking is, how can we make sure, or how can we mitigate all the negativities that rise out of different business activities? Impact investing turned its head around and asked this very question of how we can all contribute to solutions. That may be, as it says here, we want to help tackle malnutrition in Africa, or we want to help tackle the education gap. So the idea is this, and the question, the very hard question, is how can we prove that we can make a progress? That's where the measurement piece comes in. And I'm sure Karl has a lot to say about this, because this is really his field of how to really demonstrate that with different data system in place, how to use different metrics. Okay, so that's one thing. And then, I was just looking at a chat from Betsy, I believe. And then, the next thing I'd like to, thanks, Donald. I think maybe I should show my screen now. The second kind of preface I like to talk about is, I come from the NGO world. And then from the NGO world, I was involved in the build up to the 2015 sustainability goal ratification by the UN. And then during that time, Navi Pillay, then the UN Commissioner for Human Rights, said, measure what you treasure. So if you are serious about something, you need to make sure that that is properly measured. But measuring for whom and by whom for what? Those are the very intricate questions. And then, I come from this group platform called SIMI, Social Management Impact Management Initiative, and we annually have the Social Impact Day, and this is from 2018, so 2.5 years ago. We had a keynote speaker by the name of John Gargani, and I'd just like to talk to you a little bit about that. By the way, we also had Clara Barbie, the CEO of the Impact Management Project, as a keynote speaker for 2019, the following year. But now I'm talking about the 2018. And he said this, values come from people and everyone in society matters. Measuring impact is not on average. Measuring impact is not in general, but for everyone. So this is the basic tenet. And so when Navi Pillay mentioned measure what you treasure, it really depends on what people treasure as important and something that needs to be measured. And then this is also his diagram, but we need to think about impact in this kind of spectrum. You have positive on the one hand and negative on the other. You have intended upper and then unintended in the down column. And so what do you do as impact investors? You really want to focus and maximize your intended impact. But again, as IMP mentioned, as John mentioned, we always need to ask the question of for whom, whose impact or whose value are we really trying to make sure they're respected? And we don't have the same answer to that particular question. But whoever you are, you're the investor or you're the investee, you really try to maximize your intended impact, bearing in mind that you cannot control everything. There are negative impact. There are an unintended impact based on whatever you do. And so your task is to measure as much as you can, as widely as you can. So, but at the same time, you really need to focus on your intended impact. That's where the intentionality of impact investing comes in. And so that's really a key tenet for impact investing. So how do you intend? What is your intended outcome? And how are you going to achieve that? Okay, so I don't have a lot of time. So I was going to talk a little bit about what's happening in Japan. Let me say just simply, this is the GIN annual impact investor survey, where it says the impact measurement and management practice have matured. So that's really the state of affairs in 2020. But still in Japan, we have only begun to work on this domain. So Japan GSG for impact investing, the National Advisory Board started this working group, which I'm on, called the IMM Working Group. And we have started to use the IFC's operating principles for impact management, which is also something that Donald introduced to us. And then we are definitely trying to catch up with the rest of the world, this is like our understanding of where we are, where things should go to. So it's a little bit a tricky one, because a few years back, when we started this, people were all asking about the question of how can we measure impact. But then, the second, in the middle, you can see before asking how, we must ask why and what. So this is where the impact investing field has kind of matured to be more transformative. So instead of just asking how, and this is really the question that is on everybody's lips when they started talking about impact investing. But no. Our response to that is, before saying how, we really have to ask why and what. So this is like that the picture shows critical framework. This is by Karim Haji, who is teaching at the Said Business School at the University of Oxford. And then, so that's good. But then, we have started to work on that in Japan with the working group and all that. Okay, so we are telling people that, not just start with how, but the why and what are more important. But then in the last, 6 months, 12 months, I think Karl can tell us, the world has moved or evolved into something evolved, and then there's a new norm, I guess, which is really this distinguishing factor of impact investing is in the measurement. So back to measurement again. And this is because there is a steep rising concern and risk of impact washing. Now, more and more investors and people are moving into this field. There are more impact washing happening. And no wonder. But how can we distinguish between the impact washing and something that is not? I mean, the answer is in the measurement, and we should really do more measurement more carefully. And then this is, in my understanding, what Kate Ruff talked about as from the management consulting approach of management to data science approach of how to really focus on the measurement and measure it right. Actually, this is Karl's domain, so I really invite him to comment on this. I think I'm running out of time, so let me stop here. I hope I made myself somewhat clear in really setting the stage for our conversation. Thank you.
Thank you, Imata-san. I'm going to ask you a question, but we'll let Karl answer it after if he has something to say, and we'll lead this into the open Q&A. I want to ask about the why and the what, but I'm going to focus on the how, because I think that you may have touched upon it. There's a tension between measuring as much as you can and then the amount of data that's available. And there's also perhaps a tension between the investors who are investing in projects and what they want to have shown to them in terms of data so they can do measurements, and then also what the project owners themselves or the social enterprise managers can actually manage to provide while they're trying to do their work at the same time. So when you say measure as much as you can, and like how do you resolve that issue around how much data you can get and the difficulty to get more data?
Well, there are maybe two parts to answer your question. Number one is as people in the ESG world talks about, there's a notion of materiality. So what is material to your decision making is what you need to measure, instead of what is available as data or what can be comparable easily as opposed to something else. And the second part of my question, my answer to your question is that yes, you're right. Indeed, there's definitely a limit to what the data can provide, and that limits our scope of data collection and also data analysis. And that's where the evolution in the data science and AI and all technology is really giving us some hope, because what has not been possible is now becoming more possible. But still, these days, I do talk to the Japanese colleagues, investors, people in the social sector, nonprofit sector, and all that. Don't really try to do too much, because if you're trying to demonstrate your outcome with the limitation of the data availability that you have, you are going to end up, saying too much as your outcome. And then, that might attract a new funder, but that will also attract a whole bunch of skeptics that will really, cast a doubt on your reporting system.
Mm-hmm. Karl, do you have a comment on that as well?
Yeah, I'd like to emphasize the point about materiality, because I think that is it's so important, and it's so pressing at the moment in terms of where the let's say the forefront of thinking is happening. And I was also looking through the chat, and I'd like to maybe respond to a couple of those questions. The one was from Josh around unintended consequences, and the other one from Betsy around, let's say, the larger idea of sustainable development goals as a niche. Quickly to Josh, yes, we definitely do see the risk of unintended consequences in impact investing as well. You can just imagine, the idea of investing in an electric car company with the intention of creating positive goals relating to climate change, but then a whole lot of unintended consequences potentially in terms of the way they make batteries and rare earth metals, or people employed in the provision of those. So it definitely does transcend. Coming back to the idea of materiality and the bigger issues around sustainable development goals, for me, I see the interesting challenge at the moment around how do we organize and coordinate action globally at a mega level, in terms of realizing that we all collectively as individuals and organizations have a number of different goals that we're trying to work towards. These are related to environmentally, our planetary boundaries, there are finite resources and so forth, and also on a social side in terms of how do we build foundations of social well-being that we know are necessary for good functioning, well-functioning society. And trying to then use the materiality lens to say we can look at different sectors and create some sort of signaling. And when I say we, published through organizations like the UN or OECD, authoritative organizations, to say, well, based on these certain types of economic activity, we know that there will be this cluster or this set of potential impacts, both positive and negative, that are relevant, that are material, that we know. So, for example, a mining company we know has a material impact on the natural environment, on employment, potentially water pollution and so forth. Those are the important things to be focusing on before we get into other things. And to be able to use that signaling to say, before we do anything more, let's make sure that we are capturing that basic level of information, very much on the left-hand side of the spectrum, basic level quantitative information, but being able to set thresholds and allocations and targets for organizations that we can say, how do we compare to the average? And then go beyond and say, well, how do we now layer up, the idea of deeper impact management based on our specific strategy, based on our theory of change, and our particular mission as an organization to create some sort of transformational effect, which might be a little bit more nuanced and maybe very specific to that organization.
Thank you for answering some of the audience questions.
I'd like to also jump on and respond to what Josh jotted down in the chat. I don't think there is an equal there. What the ABC diagram showed from the IMP is that you really, in order to achieve C, contribute to solutions, there is a presupposition that you have already avoided your harm as much as possible. So it's not like +2 - 1 = 1. It's more like +2 - 1 is like 0. So if your harm is, or unintended negative consequence of your work is there, and then you cannot really make it 0, but you really need to try that as much as possible before you can claim any positive impact. So it's not a simple addition, I don't think.
Okay, so I was going to ask, so Karl and Imata-san, you've met each other several years before. Do either of you have questions for each other, or any comments on your presentations?
I might go first.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, were you about to come in?
No, go ahead.
I think what's just fascinating, because we haven't spoken in a few years, is just to see how much overlap there is. Particularly, you were quoting Karim Haji and Kate Ruff, two people who I think are doing really, really interesting work at the moment, and again focusing on the same issues around whether it be materiality or so forth. Almost without any coordination, we've presented slides that are, or decks that are very, very complementary, and there's a coherent story. And for me, that's really exciting to see that there is enough convergence now in the overall thinking of this field, and we're all identifying, the same areas of focus, and that's really important in the context of a field that is not very strongly regulated, and probably for the right reason, not being regulated, in that it's so diverse. But yet we do see now a groundwork for the introduction of regulation. So we see the European Commission is introducing some regulation, particularly around the green agenda and climate change, and it picks up these themes that we've been speaking about. The materiality theme that Imata-san raised, focusing on collecting data, comparable data, being able to compare that with thresholds and targets. So there's definitely a convergence, which is refreshing. I don't know, Imata-san, your reaction?
Yeah, definitely I feel the same way. Thanks, Karl. Definitely there's a conversion that is happening. I think that kind of symbolizes there is a conversion happening in the space that we work in. IMP came together only 4 years ago, 2016. Before then, everybody was talking about impact, but everybody was having different ideas about what impact is and what the impact should bring. And so, kudos to those who really worked behind the scenes to really put this all together. But, it's not just because of few people, but it's also, I kind of feel that it's a change of times. And then, the convergence was bound to happen because of the times of the rising inequality, climate crisis, and now the COVID crisis. So the world needs something good to happen. And there's definitely a community of people who are really thinking very hard to make a switch from the shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism. So on that note, I have a question for you, Karl. I think you really work in the data scene. And then, so what kind of changes have you observed in the last 2 years that make it possible for impact investing to go to the next stage? I'm conscious about the new accounting framework that includes impact in its calculation and or the setup in like the impact weighted account initiative and value balancing alliance. But not only that, if you can share your thoughts around the evolution of the data field in the last 1 or 2 years.
Yeah, I think that intersection between data collection and aggregation and how that then rolls up into accounts is really important, and it's really, I think, where the big challenge is, because like you were saying earlier on, previously everyone was talking about managing impact and doing it in very different ways. similarly, the results of that activity would be not very comparable. And so now what we're seeing is, as we're scaling up this agenda, as we're seeing the need for more comparable information, and realizing that there's a serious level of fatigue and resource burden that comes from these challenges if we keep layering up the expectation. We see the need for a radically different way. And for me, I see the introduction of a data science approach as being quite instrumental in being able to unlock the challenge. And if, in my mind, I sort of see that as an evolution from a very, let's say a business management consulting approach where something might be very niche and very focused, towards a big data approach where you need to be able to aggregate up data, and you may not get every data point that is totally accurate, but you're able to get a sense of bigger trends and a bigger picture. And we can use data science technologies then to aggregate up data in a way that is much more effective than if we use a lot of human resource to try and pull up and aggregate information out of reports and so forth. So I see maybe a change happening, or at least which I think could and should happen, is shifting the way we look at, for example, the activities of rating agencies. If you think about the likes of Sustainalytics and the others, MSCI, FTSE4Good, and so forth, who are providing ratings for ESG. If we can be able to get access to data directly from the business management systems of organizations, the length of time that a particular piece of equipment was running, and be able to then know what the carbon dioxide emissions were as a result of that, and being able to aggregate that up into non-financial accounts, I think we'd end up with being able to create an ecosystem that is much more effective. And I sometimes start speaking about that as, imagine if we had an internet of impact. What would we want that to do? In the same way that nowadays we can travel across a foreign city and we have a smartphone, and we just say, the phone knows where we are, and we say we want to go there, and it calculates. So think about the transformation that happens there under the skin of the phone, and how do we bring that into the data science approach and the accounting requirement for impact to be able to get that kind of functionality. Great.
Thank you so much for that. It was very, very interesting way to put it. I like that smartphone analogy. That was a really, really nice segue into the next part of our time together. So first of all, thanks everyone so much for coming. Donald, I don't know if there's anything you want to kind of jump in here with. What we usually do is we keep the session going for another, say, half an hour or so for people to ask some follow-up questions. If people would like to stay around for that, they're more than welcome to. Otherwise, thank you so much for joining us. And I don't know, Swint, if you have anything that you want to show before the participants who need to leave can leave. But again, everybody who can stay around, please do stay around, because we're going to continue our discussion.
Yes, I just wanted to, Trevor, if you could bring up the slide one more time about the session that GRIPS is doing in November. We just want to encourage you to keep this conversation going. We've learned a lot about the different approaches to investment, impact investment, and on November 6th, we will be helping to promote this session. And you see the speakers that are going to be there. We'll send this information out to all of you. There was also a question about the slides here. All the information that was presented here, we'll be also sending out to this in our list of this growing community. So thank you all for coming. I hope that you can stay around and uncloak and continue the conversation.
Thank you.
If I can start off with the, I'm sorry, Donald, did I cut you off?
No, I was just going to say about that event that's coming up. If you are interested in impact investing, if you've enjoyed what you've been listening to here today, Cliff Pryor from GSG is essentially the leader of the impact investing movement right now. GSG was started by Sir Ronald Cohen, who's been a supporter of impact investing for a long time. The FSA has been participating in the National Advisory Board that I believe Imata-san has also joined, that's looking at impact investing in Japan. And Shira Ishii-san is a private equity investor who was one of the first to make the switch over to impact investing in Japan with social impact partners. So this is a really top-notch group of people who are going to be speaking about the international trends in impact investing and what can happen in Japan, how they can grasp the opportunity, and also what they can add to impact investing field. So I would recommend it. We'll send out some more information starting tomorrow.
Thanks. Swint?
Yes, well, I noticed in the chat, Jody had a question, I think a good one, about the balance between what we do from the private sector versus policy from the public sector. And I wondered if either of you or our panelists would like to address her question.
Okay, I can go.
Go ahead, please, Imata-san.
Thanks for the question. To me, it's like a pendulum, swinging back and forth. Like I said, I came from an NGO world, so for the last 20 plus years, I carried some skepticism on the private sector as a whole, and the public sector is there to really regulate the free market economy and all that. But as I in the last 5 years, as I have been increasingly working in this particular space, the thinking is, whatever we can use, we need to use. And then there's definitely a change happening within the capitalism that, people who have realized that there are ways of doing business that is harmful and that is more beneficial to society. So how do we make sure that we make use of the market mechanism to promote that? And of course, public policy needs to play a big part in it. So we are working with EU, OECD, these days. But as you know very well, that some strong government bodies are not really becoming effective. So we do need to turn to something else. And then that might be in the big, private sector organizations. And like I said, to me, it's like a pendulum. And then the times change. And then whatever we can use, I think we need to use.
Yeah, I would say that just in our work and our researches, we've seen this question often comes up. And I think there's a couple things that we've seen. First of all, I think it very much depends on the country and the market, because there's, as Imata-san, pointed out, you pointed out some good examples. There are some parts of the world where governments are much more, are functioning better, I guess I should say, and are able to really serve as a partner. And you can use a multi-stakeholder approach to address some of these things as well. As I think that there's been a general consensus that the previous model where business could kind of do what they wanted and government would use a kind of light touch sort of regulation because we didn't yet understand the impacts of a lot of activities of business. Those days are over. So the one positive of this is that there's a lot more responsibility now on businesses to think about what their impact is, to kind of understand, as Imata-san mentioned earlier and Karl mentioned as well in his presentation, what our impacts are. We can't start talking about what our positive impact is until we understand all of the negative impacts that we have. So I think that is one of the positive outcomes of this. I think for business is that business is now having to behave in a different manner than it may have in the past, or pressure is being put upon them to do so.
Yeah, and I would add on to that the pressures that businesses feel are different than the ones that politicians feel. So that the concerns that politicians have in terms of maintaining their hold on power are different than what businesses have to do to maintain legitimacy in the market. And that makes it sometimes so that the businesses may have a longer term perspective than a politician who's looking to get elected the next time. based on whatever it is the concerns are of their locality. And as well, I'll just say that when we were writing the book, a number of times when we were speaking with members of international organizations, UN related or otherwise, and we said that we were focused on business in helping to achieve the SDGs, they said they thought it could be the single most powerful force to achieve it by the year 2030. So they're not public policy on a national level, but on an international CSO, perspective, they think that business has a key role to play and could be a leader here.
Oh, could I maybe react a little bit? There was another question that came in, and then love to open it up for a broader discussion. From Tove or Tovi, if I've got the pronunciation right, the question was around reflecting on the small amount of impact investing currently as a percentage of the market, and what do we need to create that mindset shift? I think it actually links quite nicely to the question of Jody, because you were talking there about the relevance of business and the private sector, and if we just think about the sheer scale of the requirement of the Sustainable Development Goals versus the existing scale of the private sector, the issue really is about how do we use very smart policy and maybe a new way of thinking about policy design to influence and shape the private sector towards achieving these goals. And in that sense, I think we can take a step back and it becomes a bit more philosophical, but we did touch on it early on in terms of it's a reframing of our capitalist model. It's introducing alongside returns and risk a new almost theoretical pillar of impact, and saying how do we want that to be driven, and what is the role of all the stakeholders. And I think fundamentally markets and so forth are social constructs, and it's about defining the rules of engagement. And that's where it's about identifying what is that balanced, let's say, new settlement between public policy design and the private sector, in being able to shape and align that so that the organizations are naturally incentivized to be nudged in the direction of impact, or investors are naturally incentivized to be nudged in that direction, and the ones who are producing negative impact are somehow penalized. So we end up in some pretty thorny discussions, which I think we do need to confront, which is the balance between positive incentives and encouragement on the one hand, and then disincentives on the other. So you might be thinking about penalties or taxes and so forth on the one hand, disincentivizing, and then also, favorable policy and rules of engagement, but also, subsidy where it's required in a very balanced way, without becoming, skewing the market too much. But we need to think about that full palette of tools that are available to shape private sector engagement.
There's thank you very much for that, for all of your responses on that. And kind of a little bit relating to that question, there's another question from Jeffrey Oyema, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, who's joining us, I think, for the first time from Tanzania, about the fact that there are a number of data collection, analysis, and agencies and methodologies. How will we compare one methodology versus another? How do we compare impact investing performance across investors if they have different data systems? Who wants to take a swing at that one first?
I think that's a question for Karl.
Yeah, all right. So I'll pick up. I'll actually pick up a point that Imata-san raised, because it was on one of the slides, and it was what Kate Ruff was talking about. And in the financial, and she uses the analogy, which is in financial accounting a few hundred years ago, people said it was impossible to compare, different types of companies, one that might have been in shipping versus one that might have been in farming, or a doctor down the street or whatever. And over time, we've identified norms such as common financial statements around cash flow statements, balance sheets, and so forth. And they'll be broadly the same, irrespective of where we go globally. But then each region or each country or each organization might have a very specific way of filling in the detail. So there's this idea of bounded flexibility. In other words, having on the one hand, a degree of setting the boundaries clearly enough so that we can distinguish between different measures, so that something measured in one area can be comparable with something in another area, where that is, one sector versus another sector, or one geography versus another sector, because the boundaries are defined sufficiently consistently. But then allowing enough flexibility beneath the surface to say, well, we need to be adaptable enough in those measures so that they're then more specific and tailored. And we can do that. We can follow the trends that have happened in financial accounting. We can it doesn't need to take a few hundred years. And then we can use new data science techniques. I know Kate Ruff is very enthusiastic around a Common Approach project, which is looking at using technologies of the semantic web, which is trying to extract signals out of words and trying to codify words. And so if you think compute with words rather than just computing with numbers, and being able to extract the meaning of words. So for example, there's always a comparison between the public school system in the United Kingdom versus the public school system in the United States. In the UK, public schools refer to essentially private schools, and that's a very different meaning. So we need to extract the meaning of words, and we can use, when we see very detailed either indicators described in words, or if we see outcomes being described in words, we can use these technologies to extract signals out of that that then can become a little bit more comparable. So very cutting edge. It's possible, but a lot of work, I think, needs to happen to get the balance right, so that everyone actually gets something useful and meaningful out of the solution.
Imata-san, do you have a comment as well?
Yeah, I'd like to build on what Karl just mentioned. I think that, like what he's saying is that there is a tension, always a tension around standardization. On the one hand, having a standardization makes things communicate more rapidly, more effectively, more efficiently. And then people can say, oh, okay, I can use this yardstick to say whether I did right or wrong. Simple. On the other hand, like my presentation mentioned, if everyone is unique, not everything can be standardized. So there's a tension and there's an evolution of things that are happening around this. And, Kate Ruff's common approach to impact measurement, if you go to that kind of webinar or like, what do you call it, a short presentation, video presentation, they talk about the standardization kills standard. So it's a kind of irony there, but that's how they are kind of building up their standards. So that's very interesting. If you, it's worth a visit. But I also like to kind of touch on what Tove and Frank mentioned in the chat column. I think on the one hand, we are absolutely correct in claiming that we do need to move from a simple shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism, where everybody's welfare is being considered. At the same time, we do live in this world where investors are bound or constrained by this notion of fiduciary duty, even though, as Karl mentioned, it's only a social construct, but it's a social construct within which many people, many powerful people with money live in. So what's the message there? The message there is, those who conduct impact investing seek both the financial return and the social/economic return. There's a misconception, we say, that by doing the impact investing, you have to live in a trade-off between the financial return and social return. We say that's not the case. But, the next question maybe show us the proof. Well, the proof is kind of being built as we speak. For example, BlackRock has started to a portfolio of investment around impact investing, and they have been showing that their portfolio actually earns more money than their other lineup of investment. That may be on.
Sorry, Imata-san, could I just stop you? You're talking about public equities, right? So these are publicly traded companies, but they're using an impact lens on them.
We have to also live, without moving the landscape too much. We also need to prove that actually impact investing makes sense for those who really are seeking financial return. So that's one way of making it more accelerated in terms of increasing the percentage within the sustainable investment arena. And that may be also a way to really talk to those who are only interested in financial return for good reasons, that this makes sense for them as well.
I would say that actually, I think one of the challenges we have is that there's some parts of this space that are easier than others. And at the moment, we're seeing some really interesting financial returns and also potential impact. So, for example, all this innovation that we're seeing and replacement proteins, for example, everything that we're seeing around. I know there was, we often give the example of we talked about them last time. Lemonade, the insurance company in the US that's having quite a bit of success at the moment and is working to kind of deploy some of their profits into social causes. So I think that from an investor's perspective, there's some, I think, parts of this that make sense and just make more sense because I think they can see the market and you can kind of see how that helps society. But then there's others that I think are a lot trickier. So, I think in terms of, Karl, what you're saying around the car, the automobile example, the electric automobile example, I think that's one that's getting a bit clearer because people are trying to work on improving the battery problem, like you mentioned, and really kind of removing the negative impacts of that. And so that we can realize, also having better energy sources, right? Where the electricity what type of energy is being used to produce electricity is another area that's a big impact challenge. So I think that's a bit of the problem too. And we talk about this a lot, in our Round the Impact Investing project we're working on. How do we deal with things that aren't where frankly, the value proposition isn't as clear. So I think that's a little bit of the problem as well. And that, I agree with you. Nobody's kind of figured that one out yet. But at least there are particular things they can invest in that are a bit clearer on that front than some others.
Trista, could I, or did somebody else want to come in? I just wanted to...
Please, Karl.
Great. I just wanted to build on your reaction because I think, there's a lot of research that's happening, and maybe it's just a little bit under the waterline at the moment around the business model viability and how that affects maybe the perspective, Frank, people like you and others are coming from. And there's some research being done by a German academic called Katrin Kreutzer, looking at the business model viability of social enterprises. And, there's two ends to the spectrum. There's the one kind of business model where impact is integrated with traditional financial performance. And at the other end, there's a trade-off. So, Trista, you were talking about the car example. Let's keep building on that. The more electric cars we sell, the greater our impact is going to be in terms of moving people away from fossil fuels onto something that's renewable, and assuming we deal with the issues along the line like batteries and so forth. But the two go in lockstep, greater efficiency with volume, more profitability, hopefully. Totally an investable proposition if the time is right for people to buy electric cars. On the other hand, you might have something like working in education with children that have special needs. Now, we know that putting more effort in and more intensive learning will achieve better outcomes, but that doesn't necessarily come automatically with... I see a few hands waving.
Saying goodbye to Frank.
Saying goodbye to Frank,
right.
yes,
Okay. Okay, fair enough. But the point was simply to say that to achieve greater impact, the cost base probably goes up. You need to put more intensive teaching around the student, maybe use more resources that are more expensive, and then we need to understand, well, how do we then, if that impact is really important, how do we drive that, understanding the business model, and then saying, well, let's look at we need to look at subsidy, we need to look at maybe impact incentives. We need to look at maybe other things, asking probing questions like, is that activity appropriate for a pure for-profit model, or should it be in a non-profit model? Or does that not make a difference? And using technocratic, evidence-based decision-making to inform how we define the balance between those things. And then, I'm just looking through the chat. A lot of really interesting questions.
Yes,
but
I think this
just to let other people
to the time.
interact.
It might connect a bit to the time dimension question
I think
too,
so, yeah,
Karl.
yeah.
Yes,
exactly.
and we should mention Izuka-san, who asked about the time frame, is our partner at GRIPS, where the next seminar will be held. So she's the official organizer of that event.
Yeah.
But yes, what are your thoughts on the time frame? I'm sorry Frank left for this this part, because I think this is relevant.
So very briefly, I'll just so one of the observations that we've had a while ago is that if you refer to, let's use investing terminology, we talk about the maturity of an investment, particularly a loan or something like that. An end date, we might be investing for 2 years or 3 years or 5 years, and then we'll want an exit, because that's maybe the optimum time frame for the financial value to maximize in terms of our internal rate of return calculations. And then, at that point, we want a financial exit and move on to the next investment. Well, impact may operate at a different timescale. So we may be talking about an investment in an electric car factory or an urban renewal scheme, that maybe the type of impact that we're focusing on takes 20 years, 30 years, 50 years. If it's something really deeply impacted, like gender inequality or things like that, and we then have a mismatch between the optimum investment horizon and the optimum impact horizon. And so in the same way that we, a long time ago invented mortgages to finance the purchasing of houses, so we can get the benefit today and pay it off over time, we need to see, what instruments, what mechanisms, what policy design do we need? They don't have to be just financial instruments. Do we need to be able to align those two things that have different time horizons?
Imata-san, do you have any comments on that?
No, I'm fine. Karl
Okay.
just responded very nicely. So
Could I actually ask you a question? We're getting, I think, down to the end, but this goes back to policy, but it's a little more tied to the news. So Abe, as Prime Minister last year at the G20, announced that he'd be looking at social impact investing, and you've been working with the National Advisory Board and the study group. What is Japanese investing community or the policy community thinking about impact investing right now as a practice that they might want to adopt, or how are they looking at it?
well, I have to be careful. This is being recorded.
I think we could stop recording at this point.
No,
Yeah.
that was like a half facetious, but I'm glad that Ikeda-san from the Financial Services Agency will be on board to talk about his attempt or the agency's attempt to really make impact mainstream within the Japanese government. And it's not easy. And of course, among the mainstream financial institutions, mega banks and big security companies, it's also not easy either. I think what we need is not just mention in the G20 statement, but the strong political will to really, in a country like Japan, as you know, the government has a lot of power to carry, and then if we see more political will coming from the political leaders, I think Japan is going to be able to move faster. Do I see that happening? I'll leave it up to you.
Okay. All right.
I'm happy to maybe start with a reaction, and then I'd also finish with a question to Imata-san as well. So I think on that particular point, we've seen for quite a while, or it's been around for quite a while, the work that SASB has been doing, the American-based organization that have been looking at ESG reporting guidance from a materiality perspective. And they've been looking at it through the lens of things that non-financial issues that are material to the financial performance of an organization. And so there's a lot of guidance there on a sector by sector basis. You can say, well, we expect information on this, this, and this because they are material risks. And then there's work that the UN Environment Programme is doing, and specifically within their finance initiative, they've got a positive impact working group, and they are expanding that logic to include non-financial issues, but really, a negative as well as positive issues. And they're taking a slightly sharper view in terms of saying, well, we're working towards an economic model where it's more integrated, and the idea of impact is really also intrinsic to what we do. And we need to identify material impact areas based on the economic activity, both in terms of financial risk, but also in terms of these non-financial effects fundamentally. And so they've extended that approach in terms of signaling, and this is work that's being published and will be evolving over time, so it's not quite fully fleshed yet. But we can then imagine an environment where, on a sector by sector basis, we can look at those schedules and say, well, an organization in this sector should be reporting these issues, 1, 2, 3, or maybe they're 5 or 6. And we can then, expect that information, because you might have examples like, for example, Adidas or Carlsberg, two very, very different companies. One makes clothing and sports apparel, and the other brews beer. They'll both be talking about environmental and social issues. Adidas might be talking about how they encourage a more sporty activity and health with their customers. And then, looking at some of their non-financial reports, they don't say anything about working conditions of their staff across their supply chain. Well, that's a material issue. On the other hand, Carlsberg say that, one thing that's very specific to their industry is responsible drinking. So they report on that, but they also report on accidents in their workplace. And so at that level, you can see, two totally different companies probably should be specializing and including very, very different data sets around social issues, but also there should be at least some element of comparable information, and that's not there currently. But through better, guidance, regulation, policy, we can imagine that to happen. And then the question for Imata-san was just if you have any reactions to what the Japanese the GPIF, the government pension investment fund is doing, because it's certainly very active. I've seen commenting on ESG issues globally, and there may or may not be a reaction on that side. And I'll use that to also thank everyone for your time today.
Okay, maybe to respond to what Karl just mentioned first, I think, of course, we all take note that the GPIF moved and shaped the Japanese political and business world a lot, and that also had a global influence, which was very positive. So we do really need to have our a second or a third initiative that follows the footstep of a good example, which we haven't really seen coming, but it doesn't mean that it's not there yet. So we'll see, in the next few years, there might be a big new initiative coming out of this country as well. And then, my concluding thought around what this idea of materiality is that I would say that we all need to come down to the issue of communication. Communication with whom, I think, is a question. But all the data or the measurement, the valuation, rating, it's all about standardization and comparability. That's very important. But at the same time, when you talk about materiality, I think people have been and will be focusing on storytelling, compelling storytelling that makes people say, yes, I would like that. I would like to support that. So it's really, it's this tension between standardization and really paying respect to what is unique in each and every activity. There's a tension and a balance as well. And to me, the importance around materiality is how to make sure that you communicate to maybe a single person and make her say, yes, that's great. And then if one person can say that, there may be 100 people who say the same thing, or maybe 10,000 people or 1 million people who say the same thing. That is also trying to build a community of like-minded people. So I think, to me, materiality is not so much about, I think it's essentially about your own value and then how to communicate that and how to rebuild the community around that. I don't know if that really answers your question. But as Karl mentioned, there's a good initiative happening around SASB. SASB and the GRI teamed up to really work together, which is great news. And then they have kind of moved out of the reporting as such space to more like impact management space overall. So, I guess this idea of a storytelling involves, like where do you start, and then how, starting from the question why. I think that's the direction of travel that I think we are collectively witnessing. And with that, I also like to thank you for staying on, and also for Donald, Tristan, and Swin, and Trevor, and all the organizers for putting this together, and for my co-presenter, Karl. Thank you very much.
Imata-san, thank you for a very inspiring ending, actually. And it reminded me of a story I heard recently about an ESG investor who wanted to find out whether the ESG ratings that he was receiving from companies were really telling the truth. So he hired an investigative journalist to go and do some reporting himself. And of course, he found out a different story completely. But I just thought that, maybe this movement might actually not only help to achieve the SDG goals, it might start to re-employ journalists, which could be a good thing too, because they're the storytellers. And if they're going out there doing the research and also then coming back and reporting on it, we're telling more stories about these kinds of projects and these kinds of progress.
Trista, any final words?
No, thank you so much to Karl and Imata-san for joining. It was, as always, I learned so much. And I feel like, we have this whole section we wrote in the books, like maybe we should write more. Yeah. Edition 2. But thank you so much. Really interesting. And I'm glad to see that, the field is moving forward, right? And there's a lot of great things. For example, you talked about a little bit around technology and such can kind of help us with some of these challenges as well in terms of measuring our impact over time.
Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate your time and staying extra and having this conversation. I also like the comments about the messaging and communication ties back to the session we had on marketing and dealing with consumers with Dom Carter and Mai Mizu. Tell a story and tell that story specifically to one person, and we will find, and it will resonate and build a community. That's what we're trying to do here. We look forward to seeing all of you online on November 6th. Thank you once again for joining our little conversation. Have a great evening.